Welcome to this exclusive content. If you don't already know who I am, my name is John Good. Guessing most of you know who I am, or all of you probably know who I am because you found the content. But in this exclusive piece of content, I specifically want to talk about how much you should budget for cybersecurity training. That's a question that comes up all the time, and I thought it'd be a really good idea to sit down and talk about this. So if you've ever seen any of my other videos or any of my content or the things that I suggest and recommend, I always suggest and recommend that you invest in yourself. Okay? You should not be relying primarily on an employer, whether that's your current employer or a future employer, to fund your career development. And specifically, we're talking about the more affordable training options. We're not talking about the things that are crazy expensive like SANS and those kinds of things. We're talking about the more affordable options that exist for training in cybersecurity. So keep that in mind as we're going through this content. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is why should you budget for training? Why does it make sense to do? Why should you do it instead of relying on your employer? Those kinds of things. So first of all, budgeting allows you, the individual, to pick the training or skills that you want to learn. Typically with an employer, if they are going to fund training or fund different programs or certifications for you to go to, they are specifically picking something that they believe internally or within a group, a working group, something like that, where they've determined it, but something that they are picking specifically for you to pursue. So in a sense, that is shaping your learning options and potentially your career and how that is going to evolve because you are having to go to a certain training that they specifically are picking. Now, another key point that I want to make is that if you select the training, if you are budgeting and you're picking the training, then you do not have to commit to that employer for a requirement. So typically what happens is when you use a training budget from an employer, they will say you have to work for us for so long. So 1 year, something like that. Usually that's pretty common, 6 months, a year. But if that's the case and you're picking it and you're budgeting it, so you're paying for it, then you don't have that commitment to that employer. And that can be super beneficial, especially regardless of how the training went. Think about this. If you're required to go to a certain training and you didn't like it, you just wanted to move on to something else and learn something else, but maybe it had a certification attached to that. And part of the deal is that you have to get certified. Well, that's a certain level of commitment that you have to fulfill. And sometimes in those specific cases, they will not reimburse it until you actually pass the certification. So that is a key distinction that happens certainly with employers that are funding training options. If you're paying for it, then you are just committing to yourself. So if you pay for it and you don't like it, well, you can slap yourself on the wrist and say bad choice, but you are only responsible to yourself. So that's a really key point as well. Now, the other thing is that you're forced to be accountable for whichever training option you select. This is kind of building on that last one. So that means that you're not going to just spend money just to spend it. One of the things that happens sometimes in organizations and teams where you get a training budget is that sometimes you're just spending the money because you have it. So you're spending it to spend it, because what happens next year is if you didn't spend all your training budget this year or the majority of it, they're going to reevaluate that budget. And most likely they will take money away saying that, hey, you didn't spend all the money we gave you or we allowed for you to spend. So you didn't actually need all that money. So we're just going to take some of it back and we're not going to allow you to spend as much. So that is important when we're talking about budgets and how to make sure you maximize that. But when you are paying for the training and you're responsible for it, you're accountable. Again, you're accountable to yourself. So you have to actually hold yourself accountable because these are your dollars that you're spending. But because they are your dollars that you're spending, you're just naturally going to be more invested in that process and in that training and making sure that you didn't go spend your money or waste your money on something that you didn't need or didn't want, or basically just attending and deciding, hey, I don't want this training, I don't want this certification, and just kind of moving on. You're much less likely to do that if you're paying for it. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but you're certainly less likely to walk away from it without at least completing that training and the certification, if there is one that's associated to it. So really important reasons for why you need to budget for training. So how much should you budget for training? That's the next question that we need to talk about. So a good rule of thumb, and I think a reasonable place to start with how much you should budget, is 1% of your annual salary. Now, I know you're probably asking, okay, well, before taxes or after taxes? Ultimately, I think that's up to you, because certainly that's going to affect how much you're actually investing. And if we're talking about before taxes, then obviously that number is going to be a little bit higher than after taxes. But I think you need to make that choice. And 1% is a pretty good level, a pretty good starting point for that. So that means if you make $50,000, and we'll just say, regardless of before or after taxes, we're just going to say $50,000 is the number that you're pulling from, or that you're deciding the amount from. So 1% of $50,000 would be $500 per year. That's not that crazy for a training budget, especially one that you're funding. That's fairly reasonable to invest 1% of your salary into your career development, because that 1% is going to go a long ways. That's going to be worth a lot more than 1% as you start racking up the different trainings and learning different information and skills and everything like that. So with $500, if you're making $50,000 and it's 1%, so $500, that can pay for a lot of books. So you can self-learn and read those. You can pay for training platforms like Cyber Training Pro or A Cloud Guru. And of course, there's other options that exist out there too that are affordable that you could put $500 towards. So $500, again, not that crazy if you're making $50,000. Obviously, everybody's in a different situation, not the same situation as each other. But 1%, that's like putting 1% in your 401k or something like that. It's just something you generally should do. Now, as you make more money, that dollar number should increase, right? So if you went from $50,000 and you were making $100,000, if you're still just doing 1%, obviously that number is going to increase. It's going to go from $500 to double that, so $1,000, because it's still 1%. 1% of 100,000, and that's how we do the math. Now, sometimes people will increase the percentage, and I think that's generally a pretty good idea, especially as you're making more and more money and increasing your job level and how much pay you're making and all those things, because you're just increasing how much you're investing into yourself. Most people are not going to go over 5% though, if they even reach that number, but ultimately you can make that choice. So if we're talking about 5% on $100,000, well, that's $5,000. And certainly at $5,000, you can pay for a decent amount of training at a $100,000 salary. Now, I'm not saying go out and do that you have to do that, but a lot of people will increase that number, because naturally, as you're making more money, you want to get some of these more exclusive training options and things that exist and that will start setting you apart. If you're making $100,000 and you can afford something that is going to drastically set you apart from somebody that is making $50,000, so instead of just both of you investing $500 going for the same kind of training options, remember, this is all about standing out. This is about investing in things that are going to help you get the skills and knowledge that you need. And naturally, just from a progression standpoint, as you are going up in levels of jobs and different jobs, or if you want to change jobs, things like that, more opportunities are available to you. So do not rule that out. Please, 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 when you're talking about how much you're saving or budgeting for your training options. Now, The next question is, how do you actually budget it? What do you do? So there's a few different things that I have as far as recommendations in order to budget for this training. The first thing that I would do, absolutely, is create a separate checking account at your bank where you only pull funds out of for training. Keep that in mind. We are trying to start isolating that money specifically for training because we want to also mentally train ourselves that that checking account, that separate account, is only for training funds. That is not for running out and getting fast food or something like that. That is trying to advance our career and progress our skills and knowledge and job and salary and all of those things that are going to continue to put us in a really good situation in life and enjoyment in our career. So create that separate account. Now, like I said, this isn't where you're going to use it as an emergency fund or even just a casual spending fund. This is just for training. It's just for training. Label it just for training. Only use it for just for training. Don't use it for other things. This is just like an investment account. It's the same thing. You don't want to just keep pulling money out and using it for things that it was not intended for, because eventually this money is going to kind of build up and you're going to have, reasonable funds that you can spend. And that way, if you don't spend it all, it kind of just keeps building up and you have a larger account with a budget for training. Now, the other thing that I'll say is that you want to make deposits automatic from your paycheck so they never hit your regular spending account, so your regular checking account. Why is that? Well, just like with 401ks and retirement plans and all those kinds of things, if the money hits your normal account, this is just basic human behavior, it's not going to register the same way. You're not going to be like, well, I'm going to put it into my regular account and then I'm just going to manually transfer it over, or have some kind of transfer that happens and moves that money over. Because what happens is you're going to get out of that habit, either not manually doing it, or eventually you're going to modify that transfer that's scheduled or anything like that. Make it just like a retirement account, make it automatic so it goes into that other account, and that way you have the funds there every paycheck and it's only for training. It's such a easy step, but even with retirement accounts, people don't do that. They don't automatically invest it, but by automatically investing it, you're never going to see it in your normal account. So you'll learn to budget that better. And then you'll have the training budget where you can use it specifically for these things, for the career development. Very, very important. And you must do that. That is so important. I cannot stress that enough. Now, employer funds. Let's talk about that for a second here, because there are a few things that I want to touch on for that. So if your employer gives you a training budget, either your current employer or your future employer, that's excellent. That is awesome. That is great to see. I love when I see employers that are investing in their employees and they're giving them a budget that they can use. Now, typically with employers, when they give you a training budget, in order to use that, you have to go through some kind of approval process. So you might have to submit a justification email or letter or something saying, hey, I want to take this training because it is relevant because of whatever, right? Whatever reason that training or certification is relevant to your program. And then somebody will approve it, typically your manager, maybe one other person, a higher up than your manager, or usually there's a couple people that are going to have to approve this. And then when it is approved and you take it, they will pay that directly to the vendor, or sometimes they will have you pay it up front and then they will reimburse you. I've seen both work and both be implemented. So it just kind of varies on those methods, which one your employer is going to use. They're basically the same thing. Obviously, if you have to pay it up front, then you've got to account for that as far as having the funds on hand. But either are essentially the same thing. And you don't just get a check to do with whatever you want. So they're not going to say, hey, here's a $5,000 check, go spend it wisely. They're going to make you justify it, and they're either, again, going to reimburse you because you're going to have to pay up front, or they're going to pay that vendor directly. They're not going to give you that check. So don't, I know that's something that people think sometimes, especially that are new to the workforce. That is not how this works. They are not generally going to do that. Now, depending on the amount that the employer gives you, you might obviously not have to invest as much personally, which can be nice. If your employer gives you a big check, say a $5,000 check or something for training, then you just don't have to spend as much of your personal money. I think you should still start to build up those funds, build up that budget of your personal money, and kind of just have that on the side. But that should be secondary in a lot of cases as far as what you spend. And we'll talk about here in a second how that can differ, or how you might make some different decisions based on that. But you should still be getting that budget, because eventually something might happen. You might change jobs, something like that. And then you now don't have a training budget. And now you want to use your personal funds, that personal budget, towards training and things like that. You have that kind of on the side so that you still can get that training that you want to actually to take or to have. Now, when an employer gives you a training budget, again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but typically they're going to have a requirement as far as how long you have to work there after that point. Could be months, could be a year. Typically, the most commonly implemented work requirement is about 12 months or a year. That's the most common one that I've seen and that I've heard about. And if you leave before that point, then they will make you pay back whatever you spent. So if you spent a $5,000 training budget and you had to work there for a year, but you only worked there for 3 months, you're going to have to pay back the $5,000. Sometimes they will prorate it. So you might only have to pay back 9 of the 12 months worth of that training budget. So of that $5,000, whatever that happens to be when you do the math. But, they might just say you have to do the whole training budget. You just have to pay back that whole training budget. And it gets kind of weird if they force you into doing certain training and they still put that kind of stipulation in there, because that is a different situation. That's not as common. Typically, it's one of those things where you agree to do the training, and because you're using above and beyond what they normally would have you do, then that's when they start putting in the requirement. But again, it can differ. You have to understand whatever the rules are in place for your organization and how they are mandating that. Now, don't let that keep you from using the budget if it's going to make a huge difference. Okay, keep that in mind. If it's going to make a huge difference, you don't want to let that get in the way. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you get a substantial pay increase. You go interview for a job, you get an offer for $30,000 more than you're currently making, and you would owe $5,000 from that training budget. So you used the $5,000 for a training budget, you got some great training or something, or maybe not even, and you interview for a new job, you got a $30,000 pay increase offer to go to that new job. Is that still worth it? Well, yeah, absolutely. Now, there are some logistics around that, because you're going to have to figure out how to pay back that $5,000 if you don't have that on hand. And a lot of times, what employers will require you to do, let's say you leave the company and you owe that training budget. A lot of times, they will take from that next paycheck or those next couple paychecks, or if they're paying you out on PTO, all of those kinds of things, they will pull from that first. And then if you still owe funds after that point, you will be required to pay additional funds or additional money back to that employer to satisfy that requirement from that training budget. But again, if you're making $30,000 more, so 6x in this case, more than what that training budget was for, that is a mathematical decision that just makes sense, right? That economically makes sense to go ahead and do, because you're going to make a lot more. But again, you have to understand the repercussions of that and how the logistics of that and how you're going to get that refund essentially paid back to that previous employer at that point. And so you can just do the math with these. If you're going to make $5,000 more for a new job offer and you have to pay back $5,000, maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe if you're going to make $1,000 more and you owe $5,000, again, that probably doesn't make sense. And you would want to just kind of work it out or kind of stick it out for the rest of that term so that you don't have to pay that back. And then hopefully you can make a bigger jump to another position when that period is up. So those are important considerations that you have to make. And certainly I've looked at those considerations before, and a lot of people do, but people don't always compare the pros and the cons of those decisions, or they don't have the funds to repay that. And then they're kind of in this weird situation because what are they going to do? They can't leave because they're not going to make it back quick enough in order to pay back an employer. Maybe you have to get a loan or something. I mean, there's definitely some less favorable situations that can exist, and that you have to weigh the pros and the cons and actually evaluate those decisions. Now, I can't stress this enough. Invest in yourself and strategically use your resources like training budgets. That is one of the biggest key takeaways that I want you to take away from this content, from this video, this exclusive content that I'm giving you. Because if you can strategically use your resources, the better that you can do it, the better off that you're going to be. You're going to have success, more success overall. You're also going to have faster success. Those are key things that happen with people that can do this with their resources and use them effectively and strategically. They get more success and they get that success quicker. So keep that in mind as you're going through your career and as you come across these different situations regarding budgets for training, because it will happen. You will have situations like this at some point in your career, guaranteed. I've been at a lot of companies where they've offered something like this, whether it's for degrees or training budgets or certifications or whatever, and you just have to make those decisions and evaluate the different decisions that you could make, the pros and the cons of those decisions. So with that being said, hope you got something out of this content and you enjoyed it. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next one. See you later.